The surprise knock came on a Sunday morning. Two sharp raps that made Helen's coffee cup freeze halfway to her lips. She wasn't expecting anyone. Nobody in Cleveland knew her well enough to show up unannounced. Through the peephole, two military officers in dress uniforms, medals catching the hallway light. Her heart dropped. "Miss Okoro?" Helen's heart stops. "We need to talk about Joseph Allen." The name hits like a fist. The old man from the bus stop. The one she fed every morning for 6 months. Helen's hand trembled on the doorknob. Joe. Something had happened to Joe. Did something? "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." Her hands shake. She hasn't done anything wrong. She just gave him coffee, breakfast sandwiches, kindness. "Why are you at my door?" "What did he do?" The taller officer's jaw tightens. "That's classified." Classified? Helen thinks about the envelope, the one Joe pressed into her hands 3 days ago. Cold fingers, desperate eyes. "If something happens to me, mail this." She mailed it. What did she just do? That morning felt impossibly far away from where it all began. If you're already hooked and need to know what happens next, drop a like on this video right now. Comment below where you're watching from. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you even doing? Hit that subscribe button because this story gets darker and you don't want to miss what Helen just walked into. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to Aria Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. 6 months earlier. Helen Okoro stepped off the 6:15 a.m. bus at Maple and Grant the same way she had for weeks. Exhausted, cold, running on 4 hours of sleep. 22 years old, Nigerian immigrant, working herself to bone dust. Morrison's Diner took her mornings, breakfast shift 5 days a week, smelling like bacon grease and burnt coffee by 7 a.m. Then nights, stocking shelves at the Kroger on East 55, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead until midnight. 2 jobs, barely rent. Her mother in Lagos depending on the money she sent home every month. The old white man was always there on the bench. Thin, gray stubble that looked 3 weeks overdue. Jacket too light for November in Cleveland. His hands shook when he held them in his lap, and he stared past the traffic like he was looking at something no one else could see. Helen had noticed him for weeks before she did anything about it. One morning, she'd bought an extra blueberry muffin, her last $2. "Morning, sir." He looked up at her like he'd forgotten people could be kind, like kindness was a language he hadn't spoken in years. "Joe," he said quietly. "Joe Allen." After that, it became routine. A coffee, black, the way he took it. A breakfast sandwich when she could afford it. Small talk that felt careful, like he was testing whether she'd actually stay or if this was some temporary charity that would evaporate. He told stories. Military service, classified operations, something about Berlin in the 80s, checkpoint crossings, code names she didn't recognize. Helen smiled and listened. She figured loneliness made people imagine bigger lives than they lived. But something in his eyes when he talked, sharp, distant, haunted, suggested he wasn't inventing anything. He was remembering. And sometimes when he looked at her, she saw something else entirely. Guilt. She didn't know it then, but those stories would change everything. By March, Helen knew Joe's patterns the way you know the rhythm of your own breathing. He was always there by 6, never asked for food, always accepted with the same 2 words. "Thank you, Helen." He never slept on the bench, she'd checked, walking past on her way to late shifts. But every morning, without fail, he materialized like clockwork. That should have been her first real clue. His shoes were too clean, not pristine, but not destroyed either, the kind of worn that came from walking, not living rough.
He flinched when sirens wailed past, a full-body reaction he tried to hide. And he never, not once, looked directly at security cameras. He'd turn his head, shift his posture, always just outside the lens. Late one night at Kroger, stocking cereal in aisle 7, Helen glanced out the window. Dark sedan, tinted windows, parked across the street for 20 minutes. When she looked again, Joe was standing beside it, talking to someone inside. The next morning, he was back on the bench. She didn't ask. At Morrison's, the whispers started getting louder. "You know that bum you feed?" Derek Powell leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "People talk, makes the diner look bad, makes you look naive." The other servers stopped covering her shifts. Their smiles went tight and plastic. Helen heard the judgment in their silence. Mrs. Patricia Henley wasn't silent at all. She stage-whispered to her daughter over eggs and toast. "That African girl probably thinks he'll leave her money or something." Helen felt the shift in her chest, like something breaking. This was the thing about kindness when you looked like her, sounded like her, came from where she came from. It got twisted, reinterpreted. A white woman helping a homeless man was charitable, noble, selfless. But Helen? She had to be running a scam, had to have an angle. Foreign girls always did, didn't they? She knew she should stop. The social cost was piling up, and she had nothing to spare. But every morning she still brought breakfast. Joe's hands trembled worse than usual when he accepted the coffee. His fingers were ice against hers. "You're a good person, Helen, better than I deserve." The guilt in his voice felt heavier now, like he was carrying something he couldn't put down.
Joe disappeared in April. 3 mornings in a row, the bench sat empty. Helen stood there each day, coffee going cold in her hand, scanning the street like he might materialize from the fog. She hadn't realized how much she'd come to depend on their routine, the predictability of it, the quiet proof that kindness still mattered somewhere in the world. On the 4th morning, he was back. He looked worse, thinner, like he'd been hollowed out from the inside. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the coffee cup. "Helen," he said, voice rough, "I need to tell you something." She sat down beside him. "What is it?" Before he could answer, 2 men appeared. Suits, dark glasses. They didn't identify themselves, didn't speak, just stood there on the sidewalk 10 feet away, watching, silent as gravestones. Joe went completely still. The words died in his throat, his face drained of color. The men stood there for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. Then they turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner like shadows at noon. Joe never finished his sentence. That same week, Derek fired her. "Customer complaints," he said, staring at the schedule instead of her face. Helen knew what that meant. She'd heard the whispers. Running a scam. Foreign girls always have angles. Maybe she's casing the neighborhood. The real complaint wasn't about her work. It was about who she was. Helping Joe had made her the wrong kind of person in their eyes. 3 days later, Tom Fisher called her into his office at Kroger. "Corporate's concerned about associations." He cleared his throat. "We need team members who represent our values." The threat hung in the air, unspoken, but perfectly clear. Her kindness had been weaponized, turned into evidence of something sinister. 2 jobs gone in 1 week. No savings, no backup plan. Rent due in 12 days. Her mother in Lagos waiting for the monthly remittance that kept the lights on and her younger brother in school. Every morning, Helen still brought Joe breakfast with money she couldn't spare. She understood the cost of kindness now, how her accent, her skin, the assumptions people made about girls who looked like her, how all of it had twisted generosity into guilt. But she couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. One morning, she sat beside him on the bench.
"I lost both my jobs," she said quietly. Joe's face crumbled. "Because of me." "No," Helen said, "because of them." The distinction mattered.
May 8th came cold and clear. Helen stepped off the bus with her last $12 converted into a full breakfast. Eggs, toast, orange juice, the works. If she was going down, rent unpaid, eviction notice probably waiting in her mailbox, she was going down kind. Joe's hands shook worse than ever when he reached for the bag. Then he pulled out a sealed manila envelope instead. "If something happens to me, mail this. Promise me." His fingers were colder than the morning air. Helen looked down at the address scrawled across the front. General Robert Ashford, Pentagon, Washington, D.C. A homeless man with Pentagon contacts. She should have asked why, should have asked what was inside, why he looked so terrified, what he'd gotten himself, gotten her into. Instead, she just said, "I will." Joe's shoulders sagged with relief. "I wasn't always like this, Helen." His voice was quieter now, stripped of pretense. "I served, really served, not the stories you think I made up. Berlin wasn't a fantasy, neither was Prague or Beirut." He met her eyes. "But I came back wrong, and they forgot me." Helen didn't know if she believed him. Military service, classified operations, government conspiracies, it all sounded like the kind of stories broken men tell themselves to make sense of how they ended up on benches. But she believed his pain was real. Joe gripped her hand suddenly, urgently. "When I'm gone, don't trust the first people who come. Mail the letter immediately. Don't wait. They'll try to make you think I was crazy. Don't believe them." Ice settled in Helen's stomach. The next 3 days felt normal, or as normal as anything could feel while unemployment gnawed at her future. She kept bringing breakfast. They didn't talk about the envelope or Pentagon generals or men in dark suits. Joe seemed calmer, like a weight had lifted. He told her about his daughter. Whether real or imagined, Helen couldn't tell. Described a life before everything fell apart, before Berlin and Prague, and whatever broke him so badly the government decided forgetting was easier than fixing. May 11th arrived quiet. Helen stepped off the 6:15 bus, coffee in one hand, breakfast bag in the other. Joe was already on the bench. He stood when he saw her, unusual. He never stood. He took 2 steps forward, smiling. "Thank you for—" He collapsed mid-sentence. Helen's coffee cup shattered on the pavement, brown liquid spreading like blood.
Helen dropped beside him, cradling his head against the cold pavement. His pulse was there, weak, irregular, wrong. Morning commuters flowed around them like water around stones. One woman pulled out her phone, not to call 911, to record. Helen screamed for help. Finally, someone called. She refused to leave him when the ambulance arrived, climbed in beside the gurney holding Joe's hand while paramedics worked with swift, practiced efficiency. "Does he have any medical history we should know about?" Helen realized she knew almost nothing about this man she'd fed for 6 months. He was in the military, I think." County General smelled like disinfectant and exhaustion. Harsh fluorescent lights, an intake nurse with a clipboard, and questions Helen couldn't answer. Next of kin? None listed. Emergency contact? Blank. Are you family? Helen hesitated. I'm his friend. The nurse's expression shifted, subtle, practiced disbelief. Her eyes traveled from Helen's second-hand coat to her face, registered her accent, her skin, looked at Joe's ragged appearance on the gurney. The unspoken question hummed between them. What kind of friend? We'll take it from here, miss. The door closed between them with a soft, final click. Helen waited 7 hours in purgatory. No information,
Nurses avoided eye contact when she approached the desk. A security guard positioned himself near her chair, watching. She was treated like she didn't belong there, like her concern was inappropriate somehow, suspicious. Finally, Dr. Sarah Chen emerged, scrubs rumpled from a long shift. Mr. Allen is stable but critical. Severe malnutrition, untreated PTSD, possible cardiac episode. She paused. Do you know anything about his medical history? Helen mentioned the military stories, Berlin, classified operations. Dr. Chen's expression softened with sympathy and skepticism. Sometimes homeless individuals create elaborate narratives. It helps them cope. Helen left the hospital at midnight. 3 buses home to Cedar Avenue, each one emptier than the last. In her apartment, she opened her desk drawer. The envelope sat there, exactly where she'd placed it 3 days ago. She'd promised to mail it if something happens. Something happened. At 2:47 a.m., Helen walked to the 24-hour post office on Euclid Avenue. The streets were empty except for occasional cars and the fluorescent glow of closed storefronts. She held the envelope for one long moment, then dropped it into the outgoing mail slot. General Robert Ashford, Washington, D.C., no return address. Please, she whispered into the silence, please let someone care.
Helen hadn't slept properly in 5 days. She'd been to County General twice. Both times they told her Joe had been transferred to another facility. No information on where, no way to contact him. Sunday morning, 9:23 a.m. 2 sharp raps on her apartment door. Helen opened it to find 2 military officers in dress uniforms standing in her hallway. The woman spoke first. Ms. Okoro, we need to talk about Joseph Allen. Major Rebecca Lawson and Captain Marcus Webb sat in her cramped living room, their uniforms making the space feel even smaller. How do you know Joe Allen? Major Lawson asked. Helen explained. The bus stop at Maple and Grant, the breakfast routine, 8 months of mornings. They listened without interruption, taking notes. Then came the questions that cut. Did he ever ask you for money? Did he ever discuss classified information? Did anyone else approach you about him? Helen realized they thought she was involved in something, part of some scheme she couldn't even name. I just gave him breakfast, she said. That's all. Captain Webb opened a tablet, turned it toward her. Joe's military record filled the screen, heavily redacted, black bars covering most of the text, but the dates were visible. Berlin, 82, Prague, 85, Beirut, 89. Those stories he told you, Webb said quietly, they were real. Helen's world tilted. Major Lawson leaned forward. Ms. Okoro, Joe Allen was a CIA field operative, 28 years of service, specialized in Cold War intelligence and asset management. She paused. He developed severe PTSD after a mission in 1994, fell through bureaucratic cracks during agency restructuring, lost his security clearance, his pension access, his identity. The system designed to protect him forgot he existed. Helen couldn't speak. Your letter reached General Ashford. Joe wrote it 2 years ago, been carrying it ever since, waiting for someone he could trust to mail it. Helen's eyes filled. He trusted me? They were the only one who saw him. Everyone else just looked past. Major Lawson's expression shifted, something softer breaking through the military formality. Ms. Okoro, Joe Allen died this morning. He never regained consciousness. The world dropped away. Helen had been bringing breakfast to a ghost for 8 months, and now the ghost was gone.
Arlington National Cemetery, 3 weeks later. Full military honors for Joseph Allen. 21-gun salute cracking through cold air. Flag folded with precision. Taps echoing across endless white headstones. Helen stood alone among uniformed strangers who thanked her for
bringing him home. She wanted to scream that he should never have been lost. After the ceremony, General Ashford found her. Silver hair, 4 stars on his shoulders, eyes carrying decades of decisions. "Your letter saved more than Joe Allen," he said quietly. Joe's letter had detailed everything, the systemic failures, how many veterans fell through bureaucratic cracks, how the system created ghosts and then pretended they'd never existed. The media storm came fast. Forgotten CIA hero found on Cleveland street corner. Joe's story broke nationally. Helen's role became public. Journalists called. Activists reached out. Politicians issued statements. Some painted her as a saint. Others questioned her motives. What was she really after? The racist backlash arrived like clockwork. Online comments flooded in. Why was some African girl the only one who helped him? Conspiracy theories about her real agenda spread across forums. Local Cleveland sites lit up with accusations that she'd exploited him. Mrs. Patricia Henley gave an interview to Channel 5. "I always thought something was off about that situation." Helen read every word, felt the poison seep in. But others saw the truth. Veterans organizations rallied around her. Black community organizations highlighted the double standard, the way kindness changed meaning based on who performed it. When white people help, it's charity. When we help, it's suspicious. Then came the letter from Washington. Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs, congressional hearing investigating systemic failures in veteran care. Helen Okoro invited to testify. She was terrified, an immigrant with an accent on national television, defending kindness that had already cost her everything. But she thought of Joe's guilty looks, how he'd known what her generosity would cost, how he'd carried that envelope for 2 years, waiting for someone brave enough to be kind anyway. She accepted. Legal advocacy groups helped her prepare. Veterans' rights organizations coached her through testimony. She wrote and rewrote her statement, practiced not crying when she talked about the breakfast sandwiches. The night before she was scheduled to testify, Helen took the bus to Maple and Grant, 6:15 a.m., like always. The bench sat empty in the pre-dawn darkness. She placed a coffee there anyway, steam rising into cold air. "This is for you, Joe. I'm ready." Capitol Hill felt like another planet. Helen sat at the witness table in a borrowed suit, microphone in front of her, cameras everywhere, senators in tiered seats like judges. Her hands shook the way Joe's used to. She spoke clearly about the breakfast sandwiches, the stories, the quiet mornings at Maple and Grant, how he never asked for anything, how the system that trained him for decades abandoned him when he came back broken. Some senators listened with genuine compassion. Others performed concern for the cameras. Senator James Gaines leaned into his microphone. "Ms. Okoro, how can we be sure you weren't taken advantage?" Helen's patience snapped. "I lost 2 jobs feeding him." Her voice cut through the room. "I kept my promise with a sandwich. You kept yours with paperwork that buried him." Silence. Senator Maria Cortez asked the question that mattered. What should we do differently? Helen didn't have policy answers. She just told the truth. See people. Actually see them. Joe Allen sat on that bench for 2 years before I noticed him. Then everyone noticed me noticing him. That's the problem. The Joseph Allen Initiative was announced within weeks. $200 million in funding for veteran outreach, special task force to identify lost veterans, mandatory review of all cases from the restructuring era. Helen was appointed community liaison. She helped identify and connect with at-risk veterans, worked with immigrant communities often invisible to the system. First financial stability she'd had in years. 6 months later, Helen returned to Cleveland. Still took the 6:15 a.m. bus, still sat at Maple and Grant, but now she brought extra coffee for others on benches, trained volunteers in what she called radical noticing. She met Maria one cold morning, homeless woman at the stop. Veteran? Didn't matter. Human? Yes. Helen brought her breakfast. History repeating, but this time Helen had backup, resources, a system that was finally watching. One winter morning, Helen placed coffee on Joe's old bench. A young black girl getting off the bus watched her with curious eyes. Helen smiled. "I always bring extra. Want to help?" The girl hesitated, then nodded. Kindness multiplying, legacy living. Helen sometimes still felt Joe's presence, that guilty look he used to give her. She understood it now. He'd known what her kindness would cost, knew she'd pay it anyway, and he knew, somehow, that the cost would matter. "Thank you, Helen," she heard on the wind. She whispered back, "Thank you, Joe."